David, can they see us yet?
Yes, we're live. We're live. Folks are trickling in. Welcome everyone to the BARI conference. We're going to give everyone a minute to trickle in as our virtual door is a single line file. So it's going to take everyone a minute to get in. So we'll give it about a minute and we'll go ahead and get started.
David, can they see us yet?
Yes, we're live. We're live. Folks are trickling in. Welcome everyone to the BARI. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the BARI conference, Building Back Smarter. We welcome you to How Do We Build When We Build Back panel. And this panel will be moderated by none other than the President and CEO of Mass Development, Dan Rivera.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited for this panel and excited to see what the work that's being done to build back better. I think the first thing that we're going to do is go through an introduction of who we have with us today as part of the panel. And we're really joined with a lot of great people. First off, we have Katie Tomshow, who's a doctoral candidate in environmental health at the Harvard Chang School of Public Health. She receives her BA in environmental studies at Dickinson College and her MPH at Boston University School of Public Health. Her prior experiences as a community organizer focused on environmental science led to her interest in effective communication of environmental health data. She's interested in research focused on environmental exposure data, report back, and environmental health literacy. Welcome, Katie. We have Philip Ish-Gates, who joined Synapse Energy Economics, Inc. in Cambridge as a senior associate in October of 2019. He's an engineer and policy professional specializing in energy efficiency, distributed energy resources, and low carbon energy technologies. His policy experience includes energy and climate planning, innovative financing mechanisms, incentives and regulations for building decarbonization and strategies to transition in low carbon systems. He's managed over 4,000 building retrofits and distributed energy resource projects across a variety of technologies. Welcome, Philip. I hope I didn't crush your last name too badly. And Chris Goverston is an interdisciplinary engineer, PhD candidate in Northeastern University, and she has a civil engineering background, a master's in sustainable building systems. She's an EIT lead, AP, AP as well. So welcome, Chris. Chrissy, I think we call her. Before we get into the videos, I think it's important to note, again, I'm Dan Rivera. I'm the president and CEO of Mass Development, Commonwealth Massachusetts Finance and Development Agency. After having served 7 years as mayor of the city of Lawrence, just want to make sure you know that Mass Development works with businesses, nonprofits, banks, and communities to stimulate economic growth across the Commonwealth. During FY 2020, Mass Development financed or managed at least 341 projects, generating investment of more than $2.69 billion in the Massachusetts economy. These projects are estimated to create or support about 10 to 11,000 jobs and build and preserve about 1,700 housing units. So I'm thrilled to be here and with you all and be a part of the BARI conference this year. Congratulations also to Boston Area Research Institute Initiative, BARI, on their 10th year anniversary. Advancing a more equitable, just, and democratic society. BARI is an inter-university research partnership with Northeastern, Harvard, in conjunction with the city of Boston, that pursues original urban research on the cutting edge of scholarship and public policy. Thank you all for all you do in these efforts. Now, I'm looking around the screen and I feel like I did something wrong so far. Dave, can you help a brother out?
No, you're all set. You're all set. We're going to jump right into the videos.
All right, cool.
Hello, my name is Katie Kamsho. I'm a PhD candidate at the Harvard T.H. Chan, and I'll be
David, I don't think there's audio.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a way to communicate that. We may want to start Katie's video again.
Okay, I apologize. You guys couldn't hear. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. We'll start over.
Hello, my name is Katie Kamsho. I'm a PhD candidate at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and I'll be presenting on evaluating environmental health data communication to participants of a Boston area indoor air quality study. So humans come into contact with compounds in their environment that can impact their health every day. And that could be things like eating fish with mercury in it, breathing in air pollution from cars, or putting lotion on skin that can contain certain chemicals. And environmental exposure assessment is a means of measuring certain exposures either before or after they've occurred. And there is increasing interest in the exposure assessment domain to report back exposure assessment data to the participants of research studies. And this is partially motivated by an increase in participatory science methods and partially motivated by the possibility that information can be actionable for those receiving it and could lead to reduced exposure to harmful compounds. So there are a variety of more specific motivations for researchers to report data back to participants. It can enhance knowledge democratization. It can address stigmatization within polluted areas. It can be used to promote policy change. It can motivate action by participants to reduce their exposures. And it's been suggested that it can increase participants' environmental health literacy. But the problem with this statement is that we don't have established means of measuring our success in communicating data back to participants, and we don't have a foundation in what it means to increase environmental health literacy or to show progress in it, or what it means to be fully environmentally health literate. And there also exists, despite best intentions of communicating data back, a suite of issues that currently plague the environmental data report back efforts. First, there are challenges with providing the information back in a sensitive way, specifically if there's not always a health-based benchmark for the compounds being studied, which makes it challenging to communicate data within risk categories or to suggest specific actions that participants could take based on their data. There also aren't established tools to ensure accessibility of the materials. So data and numerical components are an integral component to data report back, and there are not yet best practices that give clear guidance on how to best present these to reach all audiences, regardless of their numeracy or literacy skills. And finally, most of the evaluations of environmental data report back efforts so far have focused on the amount of knowledge gained by participants after receiving their data back. And this approach misses the existing ways that participants already think about their personal environments and the exposures before participation, and it doesn't evaluate the actual communication itself. So we need to broaden the way that we think about this and think about communication as a bidirectional exchange that accounts for the role of our communications that we are producing and the impact that that has on participants' motivations and the knowledge that they glean from these types of communications. So I'm going to focus on a specific data report back effort that we just finished in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And this was with participants of the home-based observation and monitoring exposure, or the home study, which asked how the housing characteristics and resident behavior affect indoor air quality, noise, and thermal comfort. So participants hosted the monitoring equipment pictured here for 1 week each in the summer and the winter season, which collected a variety of variables that were related to their indoor air quality. We then communicated back their nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter data back to them via a written component and then via Zoom meetings afterwards. And these two pollutants were chosen for communication because there are clearly identifiable sources of them within the home. There are demonstrable health impacts that are associated with them. And there are also reasonable actions that we can suggest within the home that are accessible to many people that can reduce their indoor air concentrations of these two pollutants. So the scope and purpose of this effort was to communicate the nitrogen dioxide and particulate matter data back to participants of our study. And we wanted to determine how we could best tailor the messages to meet their existing needs and concerns, and to be self-reflective in terms of identifying the impacts of our messages' qualities on their understanding of these exposures and their desires to act upon them. So this is the logic model that we developed to inform our evaluation of whether or not we provided and engaged in an effective data report back. So we evaluated our efforts based on 4 different domains: engagement, communication of key information, the motivation to act, and impacts of perceived self-agency. So for engagement, we asked broadly who we reached through this effort. Were the people we reached different in terms of their demographics? Were they different in terms of their measured indoor air pollutant concentrations? And specifically within that, did we reach the people who had higher exposures in their homes? And this is important because it leads us to reflect on whether we are reaching the vulnerable groups that we think might be more at risk from these exposures. For key information communication, we assessed both the materials that we created using evidence-based health literacy tools and whether the participants took away the key information that we hope to communicate. And this sort of dual directionality allowed us to link the quality of our developed communication materials with the outcome of whether those materials were successful in communicating pivotal information about the pollutants. We also assessed whether participants felt motivated to act based on the information and evaluated what they planned to do after reading. And this allowed us to determine whether they were taking actions that we suggested within the materials or whether they didn't feel actions were necessary with their homes based on their results. And finally, we asked participants whether they felt they had the ability to control their indoor air quality and whether they now had the information that they needed to do so. So this allows us a more nuanced understanding of their decision-making process on whether to act and facilitates our understanding for future efforts of what barriers still exist for them in their own contexts. So to zoom out a bit on why this matters, improving the process of environmental exposure data report back is an equity issue. Many of the things that we're exposed to are not perceptible to our senses, which means that equipment is necessary to identify their presence. And access to this type of training and equipment is not available to everybody. Additionally, the information from exposure assessments is not equitably distributed, and this is where data report back can assist with data democratization. We can provide this data back to the people from which they originate and enable them to make decisions based on their personal results. But the benefits of data democratization and data return only exist if they are done with care and in a way that is accessible to all participants. If we provide environmental communications that are jargon-laden or unclear or require high numeracy skills, we risk perpetuating data inequities and health disparities that already exist by only facilitating data understanding and motivating action in those with more advanced literacy and numeracy skills. We must improve our evaluation tools to facilitate more equitable distribution of data back to all participants in a demonstrable and evidence-based way. Thank you.
I think we still can't hear.
Hello, everyone. Is everyone having a hard time hearing?
Yeah, we can't hear this.
Yeah, we can't hear. Nothing's going on.
Okay, just a second.
Katie, I got to tell you that data democratization has a beautiful ring to it. You know, having been at the forefront of filling out vast numbers of surveys, and like maybe 1% of the time you get feedback. You know, and then you're part of they give you some high level stuff, like 25% of the people said XYZ, and you're like, am I in that 25%? So
Yeah, it's nice to get feedback from that.
I think it's cool, you know, but I think it's good that you point out that it's not, you know, it's also difficult. My new thing to tell people is we should probably be a little less hard on each other. You know, it's hard to you good, David?
Just a second. Yeah, can you guys hear it now? I'm gonna put it on now. Hopefully we'll be all set.
Hello, my name is Katie Tomshow. I'm a PhD candidate.
Katie, I got to tell you that data democratization has a
And
beautiful
I'll be
ring to
presenting
it.
on evaluating
You
environmental
know,
health data
having
communication to
been at the
participants of the
forefront of
Boston
this is
area
Katie's
for air quality
filling
study.
out We can hear Katie's, but we
Vast
have
numbers of surveys, compounds in their environment, like maybe 1% of the time you get feedback. Fish with mercury in it.
You know, and then you're like, you're part
David,
of
we're hearing the previous presentation.
25% of the people
Yeah,
said
David.
XYZ.
And environmental
You're like,
exposure
am I in that
assessment is a means
25%?
of measuring certain exposures either before
So
or
I
after
think it's-
feedback from that. And
that's what I
there is
think is cool,
increasing
you know.
interest in the
But
exposure
I think
assessment
it's good that
domain
you point
to
out
report
it's
back
not,
exposure
it's
assessment
also,
data to the participants of research studies. And this is partially motivated by an increase in participatory science methods and partially motivated by the possibility that information can be actionable for those receiving it. Hello, my name is Katie Tomshow. I'm a PhD candidate at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and I'll be presenting on evaluating environmental health data communication to participants of a Boston area indoor air quality study. So humans come into contact with compounds.
David,
in
I think
the
this is still
environment that can
the
impact
previous presentation that we just heard.
So, okay, so you guys heard everything from there?
We heard this presentation.
yeah, we
Yeah.
heard all of this part of it. We're just in the wrong place, I think, in the.
Okay, okay.
There you go. Now go back. Yeah.
Where? Just let me know where you guys couldn't
At the
hear.
beginning of the next deck. A little bit more. Yeah, next page.
There we
I would
go.
go one back and then play it. There you go.
Hello, BARI attendees. My name is Philip Esch Gates, and I'm a senior
There you go,
associate
Phil.
at Synapse Energy Economics. The City of Boston commissioned Synapse to perform an in-depth building energy and emissions analysis to develop a framework for mandatory greenhouse gas emissions targets for buildings that decrease over time. Today, I'll be sharing with you a summary of this work. David, we can't hear at the moment.
Now, yeah, now it's dead again. Yeah, David, you gotta not mute. Thank you, Jenny.
To reduce
right.
building-related emissions, the city enacted an ordinance that requires building owners to report their energy use each year.
Can we start him over again?
To reduce that energy use. However, emissions are not decreasing fast enough from energy use in existing large.
Just go back to and then stay unmuted. Sorry about that, David.
Ash Gates, and I'm a senior associate at Synapse Energy Economics. The City of Boston commissioned Synapse to perform an in-depth building energy and emissions analysis to develop a framework for mandatory greenhouse gas emissions targets for buildings that decrease over time. Today, I'll be sharing with you a summary of this work. The City of Boston has committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and has determined that addressing emissions from energy use in existing large and medium-sized buildings will be a crucial aspect of attaining this goal. Building energy use accounts for over 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in Boston. In 2013, to monitor and reduce building-related emissions, the city enacted an ordinance that requires building owners to report their energy use each year and perform periodic actions to reduce that energy use. However, emissions are not decreasing fast enough to meet the city's climate action goals, in part because the policy does not have binding targets. For this reason, the city is preparing to enact a building emissions performance standard. As part of the policy development process, the City of Boston tasked Synapse with convening and facilitating discussions with a technical advisory group of leading experts in building science, energy policy, and related disciplines. With the support of the technical advisory group, we prepared emissions targets, compliance strategies, pathways to net zero carbon, and cost estimates. We developed a building energy and emissions performance model to evaluate how the city can strategically design its performance standard to cost effectively meet the 2050 greenhouse gas target and its interim goals. The model uses raw data from local buildings to create a bottom-up assessment of all energy and emissions produced through operation of the regulated buildings. We analyzed a series of scenarios and sensitivities to compare the long-term decarbonization impacts of various policy designs and develop greenhouse gas reduction pathways for Boston's building stock. The results of this analysis provide discrete policy options, identify cost impacts, and forecast progress towards the 2050 climate goal. We conducted a series of meetings, surveys, and feedback sessions with the technical advisory group to solicit input on key design aspects for the performance standard policy, such as those shown on this slide. The insights gained through this process were key inputs to the policy development process that followed. How should Boston regulate its large and diverse stock of buildings? Emissions vary considerably building to building, even after accounting for different building sizes. The activities that occur within a building are typically the most influential determinant of its emissions. Thus, the city's policy should ensure that targets for one group, such as healthcare facilities, differ from those for another, for example, office buildings. We began the policy development process by identifying locally appropriate building types using a series of statistical analyses and a review of operational characteristics of the buildings. In this figure, we show how the distribution of emissions intensity varies across all of the regulated buildings by type. Should Boston's performance standard regulate emissions solely based on building type? Are there other important determinants of emissions that the policy should consider? To answer these questions, we controlled for the impact of building type and studied correlations between emissions and a range of other building characteristics. For example, this figure shows how emissions intensity varies by year of construction for each building type. A primary outcome of our work was emissions targets that decrease over time, consistent with the Boston's climate targets, a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 and a 100% reduction by 2050. We used an optimization model to select the thresholds in kilograms of carbon dioxide per square foot of building area that will deliver aggregate reductions aligned with the city's targets. This figure shows the resulting emissions across all office buildings over time, assuming every building currently above the policy threshold minimally complies with the policy. Next, we quantify the total effect of the policy within the context of an electricity grid, which uses increasingly more clean energy sources over time. This figure shows both the annual and cumulative emissions reductions. Boston's emissions performance standard will require that covered buildings achieve net zero carbon emissions by year 2050, but it will not prescribe how buildings must meet that target. Owners will be faced with important trade-offs between the costs and benefits of available technologies and techniques. While each building's pathway to decarbonization may be different, every building will need to accomplish some combination of the following approaches to reducing emissions. 1, retrofitting buildings to be more energy efficient. 2, eliminating the use of fossil fuels. And 3, generating or purchasing clean energy to power building operations. To identify net zero carbon pathways for the regulated buildings, we begin by modeling the end-use energy and preparing detailed characterizations of building attributes, energy, emissions, and equipment systems, using data from a breadth of sources. This figure provides an example of the results of this analysis: estimated end-use emission profiles for each building type and all regulated buildings in aggregate. Next, we identified a series of emissions abatement strategies appropriate to the stock of regulated buildings. For each strategy, we quantified potential energy and emission savings associated with implementation across the buildings. And then we estimate the life cycle costs and savings. This figure provides detail on one of the strategies we evaluate: cold climate insulation and moisture control strategies that are appropriate for masonry and cast walls, which are the dominant construction types in the Boston buildings. After identifying the emissions reductions, we quantified implementation costs and energy cost savings for each decarbonization strategy. This figure shows the underlying cost data used in the model for insulation retrofits that we studied. Next, we estimated on equal terms the cost to reduce emissions across all strategies, the amount of emissions a building can eliminate for a given dollar of investment. We estimated the levelized cost of greenhouse gas abatement in dollars per lifetime metric ton of carbon dioxide for each strategy. Finally, achieving net zero carbon will require a comprehensive approach, including retrofitting the existing building infrastructure, upgrading equipment systems, switching away from fossil-based fuels, and procuring or installing renewable energy sources. We concluded our work by preparing a holistic citywide pathway to net zero carbon for the regulated buildings, using the comprehensive package of energy efficiency measures at all properties. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Gebertson. I'm a PhD candidate at Northeastern University. I have been working on ways to assess housing vulnerability to extreme temperatures. By extreme temperatures, I mean higher or lower temperatures than average for 3 or more days. You may know these extreme temperature-related weather events as heat waves or polar vortexes. For this conference, I applied the methods I've been studying to Boston, and I'm excited to share my results here with you today. I know that the theme of this panel is how do we build when we build back, but with extreme temperatures, property is rarely destroyed. For these type of natural hazards, it's important that we are not reactive, we must be proactive. Heat waves kill more people in the United States annually than all the natural disasters combined. Due to climate change, extreme weather events will occur more frequently and last longer, exacerbating the vulnerability of the system that's already vulnerable. So how do we minimize the impacts of a disruptive event like a heat wave? We improve the system's resilience to the event. In order to reduce the impact of a disruptive event, also known as improving resilience, we must proactively reduce vulnerability. But first, we must assess vulnerability. We must find out if our system's even vulnerable to these events at all, and if so, how vulnerable. Traditional assessment methods involve home visits. The length of time for the home visit varies by the professional and the test done. For the sake of this example, let's say that one person can do one house a day. To assess the entire street, it could take one person 2 weeks. It would take much longer for one person to assess the whole neighborhood. This kind of assessment requires a lot of time, money, labor. It's in our best interest to turn to other methods of assessment. There are 2 main characteristics which can exacerbate vulnerability to extreme temperatures: social demographics and infrastructure. Both characteristics can be assessed by using a combination of public and private data sets. The focus then became to identify where geographically these vulnerabilities overlapped for targeted reduction of vulnerability to help those who needed it most. To assess social vulnerability, I used the American Community Survey from 2018, the 5-year averages from the federal government. I looked at these listed social characteristics that were considered vulnerable populations. The data was provided on a census block level, so aggregated up to the ward level. Although this geographical boundary is used for elections, it was the smallest boundary that aligned with the other data set. Each ward was assigned an informal score for each vulnerable population, and these scores were then summed together to give an overall social vulnerability score. This left Ward 1 East Boston and Ward 18 Mattapan the most socially vulnerable to heat waves. Next, using publicly available property assessment data from the city of Boston, I investigated infrastructure vulnerability. This data is provided on an individual parcel level, which is aggregated up to the ward level. I informally scored the city of Boston's infrastructure in the same way. This left East Boston, Austin Brain, and the Dorchester area with older homes that were less likely to have access to air conditioning. To combine the scores, I normalized them so their scores were equal parts social demographic and equal parts infrastructure. Doing so made East Boston the most vulnerable to heat waves. Without more information about the home, it would be near impossible to estimate the vulnerability to extreme cold. The best way to understand how homes operate under extreme temperatures would be to model them. Programs like MassSafe have been expanding access to smart thermostats in homes across Massachusetts. Residents who have purchased the ecobee smart thermostat can agree to anonymously donate their data to science, when that data can be used to build these models. When a home in a neighborhood requires a smart thermostat, the data collected from that smart thermostat can be used to identify the thermal characteristics of that home. The adequacy and efficiency of that home's building envelope and heating and cooling equipment can then be assessed. These thermal characteristics can also be used to run a simulation to assess that home's vulnerability to extreme temperatures. Homes nearby that are of similar size and built during similar time frames likely have similar thermal characteristics and therefore similar vulnerability. This process can be used to scale the vulnerability from the ecobee datasets to the entire neighborhood and eventually the Boston metro area. The data from this program includes metadata and numerical data on 5-minute intervals. While this data does not contain exact information regarding a home, such as address, it provides just enough to develop a model to identify thermal characteristics derived from a first-order linear system, built upon the understanding of a net heat flow through a home. As you can see on the right here, there's a summation of the heat flows through the building envelope, and that can be reduced to a system identification matrix and solved using simple linear regression. From the ecobee smart thermostat, we have the indoor temperature, the outdoor temperature, and the equipment runtime, and which equipment is running. From this information, we can calculate the thermal characteristics of the home's envelope and equipment. These same thermal characteristics can be used to predict the home's response to a change in outdoor temperatures. This can be done for regular temperatures and extreme temperatures. We can even predict how a home may respond during a power outage when the equipment is unable to turn on. I turned to the 59 homes in Boston, Cambridge, Charlestown, Dorchester that were available in the 2016 ecobee DYD, which is the Donate Your Data dataset. These homes were a variety of styles, ranging from new construction to dwellings over 120 years old. I used the methods described previously to identify their thermal characteristics, and then I simulated a power outage on January 29th, 2021, as if it were to occur during this past January's polar vortex. The results of the analysis showed, on average, the indoor temperature of these homes could have reached 40 degrees within 2 hours of the power going out and below freezing within 10 hours. Granted, that sample is a very small sample size of 500,000 homes in the Boston area. So moving forward, we hope that future releases of the ecobee data will include more homes in the Boston area thanks to programs like MassSafe. We then hope to replicate the analysis with parcel assessment information and census information by neighborhood instead of ward to compare the neighborhoods to one another. While we're unable to complete that next step due to data limitations at this time, our analysis using the publicly available data does have results worth pursuing, and that can be completed proactively before disaster strikes. We know that heat wave vulnerability is geographically concentrated. Expanding access to air conditioning in geographically vulnerable areas to heat waves is an important first step. Using programs like MassSave, we can expand home energy assessments to find vulnerabilities. Financial incentives like rebates and the heat loan can improve insulation windows and encourage the installation of energy efficient air conditioning equipment, and increase the number of people in Boston who participate in the ecobee Donate Your Data program. The tools are there, but community-based targeted action is needed to reduce vulnerability to heat waves in areas of Boston, like East Boston and Allston, but also encourage participation in programs like the ecobee Donate Your Data dataset so that we can create more accurate prediction models of homes in the greater Boston area. Thank you for your time today. I look forward to any more questions you may have. My name is Chris. Please feel free to contact me at this email address if you're unable to ask questions during the panel today.
Thank you so much. That was so much good information. And seeing that I have very little to add to the actual data part of it, I'm going to stop talking and get to the nitty gritty. It's such an important topic as we think about building back, but people still can't get their where they're at psychologically is here with COVID-19. And so as the pandemic continues, because we're still not out of it, it's really at the top of people's minds. So my first question for each of you is to tell us if there's any intersections between COVID-19 and your research. And I'll start with Phil, if you like.
Sure, thank you, Dan. I would say absolutely. Buildings sort of are at the nexus of a number of the issues that have been raised societally for COVID-19. I would note, air quality, our understanding of the science of how COVID-19 spreads has led to a lot of changes in how buildings are operated and occupied, certainly on the commercial side as well as residential, and increasing ventilation rates, opening windows, adjusting how we heat and cool buildings is one of the strategies for minimizing the impacts of COVID-19. And there's a lot of intersectionality there with energy use in buildings. So as we think about upgrading and changing our existing energy systems in buildings, it's an opportunity to make them more efficient and switch away from fossil-based fuels for heating in particular. And also as the usage patterns are changing, people are working from home more and more. Commercial buildings are seeing lower occupancy rates. It's an opportunity to rethink how we occupy our buildings, how we schedule them, and design the energy systems that serve those buildings.
Everybody's trying to figure out the future of work, and so I think that's a really good point of it. How about you, Chrissy? And feel free to say no, there is no connection, Dan. Keep moving. I don't want to feel like you guys have to respond.
I think that, like you said, work from home adds a really interesting degree of freedom. So, if you don't have air conditioning, I remember last summer was pretty rough for a lot of people because finding an air conditioner, finding fans, things like that was pretty difficult. I know a lot of people have been undertaking home improvement projects because now they feel like they have the time too. So I think that it's good that people are spending more time at home and they're taking the time to invest in themselves for whether it's energy efficiency or just thermal comfort at home. But it really does bring into perspective, making your space safe and healthy and comfortable when you have the ability to do that. In terms of the, going back to the office, like Phil had mentioned, the most expensive part of having a commercial building is paying your employees. And so worker productivity, even pre-COVID, was really important, making sure your employees were comfortable so that they could work and you could make money. But even now with work from home, I think that worker productivity will be more of the discussion moving forward, whether that's making people comfortable at home or giving them the flexibility to work at home or work in the office, or 32 hours instead of 40, things like that. The future of work will definitely be in discussion.
Katie, anything?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap with the work that I did. Particularly last March, I was engaged in interviews with a bunch of our participants, asking them about how they think about their homes' indoor air quality. And that started the week before everything went into shutdown in Boston. And I think about people asking me about their indoor air quality then and how much that must have changed in the last year in terms of how we think about safety with air quality in our own homes, and the changes in terms of our exposures to pollutants being a lot more consistent than when we were able to leave our homes and go to school and things like that. So I think it's also relevant in terms of thinking about health communication. And we've seen some challenges with that with COVID-19 in terms of what the best practices are and making sure that that information is available. And there's intersections in terms of challenges with indoor air quality and multifamily housing that exist both with COVID-19 and with some of these indoor air pollutants. So I think there's a lot of synergy there as well.
I mean, I think that whole idea of the democratization of the data, right? So we come to this great understanding as a society about what the problem is, but it's all in $50 words. And everybody's like, what does that mean? For the schools part, we're doing, you got to do synchronous and asynchronous. You guys ever hear this thing going on? And I'm on the school board, and I said, can somebody tell me what that means? Because I don't know what that means. And so I think, again, is an important part of getting that information out, making sure it happens timely. Having those, especially in a time when everybody's freaking out, when everybody's really concerned about their health, the health of their families. It's really important to have that data like that. I was a local official. I'm not anymore. I'm a state level worker now. But as we look to rebuild after this pandemic, what are some areas based on your research, individual research, that you think mayors, city councilors, state reps, state senators, speakers of the House, we just with this before, the federal government, the president and his team are off in one direction, and they're going to be, sending resources to the communities. If the infrastructure bill passes, the last effort of the COVID-19 support dollars are on their way. What do you think, based on your research, are some of the things that those folks as closest to people should be focused on? And we'll do Chrissy first.
I think energy poverty is something that every government everywhere should focus on because it will help people directly, which as like politicians, they want you to vote for them. So it's a really good outreach, to set up something that directly impacts people. So energy poverty is very prevalent in the United States. If you spend more than $150 on your electricity a month, like you yourself are in energy poverty. And the disparity between how much you spend on your energy varies greatly by who's wealthy and who isn't. So poor people spend a larger percentage of their income on energy, whereas wealthy people spend a lower percentage, even if they spend more. So energy efficiency and like how old your heating equipment is, how efficient it is, those things really matter, and they matter every day because you pay for those things every single day. And if they can, part of this infrastructure bill would be to update American homes, whether you're a renter or an owner, because right now a lot of the policy really only benefits people who own, but people who rent, whose landlords aren't necessarily concerned with how much your energy bill is, those are the people who need it the most. They need to be able to save to be homeowners someday. And so there needs to be a push for reducing energy poverty in renters nationwide, for sure. And that's one thing that everyone could tackle.
I tell you, when we went through the gas crisis in Lawrence, Columbia Gas said, okay, we're going to replace people's, appliances. And they made like a big deal about it. And I said, let's not be dumb. I mean, you really were going to do that anyway. We were on a mandate by the state to reduce these emissions and create a better place. But, every tragedy with this is a silver lining. And part of it is that all these folks got better equipment. There is a big push, and I'm not blind to it. And I'm not choosing a side on it. I know people want to move farther away from that type of energy resource. But, there would have been a bigger tragedy in Lawrence if people had even older pieces of equipment, like an open flame in the household, stuff like that. So, understanding the vulnerabilities help us to target those places so we can attack that energy poverty. You guys are coming up with some good terms.
And the average person isn't really aware of the electrification process. So like if you were to go buy a new oven and you've had a gas oven your whole life, you'd probably buy another gas oven because you didn't know that it was polluting your indoor environment, or that it was more dangerous for your children, or that it was less efficient, that it uses fossil fuels, like all these very easy things, like they just don't know. And that's where, information is important, and push from governments of, hey, we'll give you $200 to get an electric stove instead of a gas stove. Things like that do make a difference.
Chrissy, I didn't know people still had gas dryers. I thought that was crazy. But there was a lot. It's a big thing,
And we don't know how many there are. Lots of questions.
Definitely. Phil?
Yeah, thank you. I would certainly echo everything that Chrissy suggested. And note that buildings are really at the intersection of climate, health, and equity. And so this is a great area of opportunity as we think about both our physical infrastructure as well as our human infrastructure and capital. There's an opportunity to improve both simultaneously. And I think that government entities can work towards this by providing financial support. As Chrissy mentioned, you can provide direct incentives to make transition away from the less clean infrastructure and towards more clean and energy efficient infrastructure. I think there's also an opportunity for government to provide financing mechanisms that help reduce the upfront cost of converting over the infrastructure and create pathways towards these sometimes more expensive, but in upfront, but types of equipment that will save in the long term. And just would also note that there's a real opportunity, I think, for government to provide some clear policy signals that align with these priorities. Boston's building performance standards is a real clear example of this. They planted the flag at 2050. They've said we need to be carbon neutral by that point. And so as you're thinking about your infrastructure, when your oven goes out, that by 2050, you're not going to be able to use carbon emitting sources of fuels. So you need to begin thinking about how to transition that infrastructure towards the end of its useful life. And having those clear policy signals up front allows building owners and building occupants to plan accordingly.
Yeah, and so, the question was about where they should focus, but I wanted you to be clear. We're talking about where they should spend money. And so, Katie, where do you think they should spend some money when you think about the local, the state, and the federal governments, seeing that we're in this effort, but that's not to say, Philip, you're right. They should be saying, hey, we want to be walking in this direction. And they could do that by the ISD stuff that you were focusing on. Everybody listens to the inspectors in ISD because if you can't get your permit, you can't move. So I appreciate that. Katie, where do you think they should spend some money?
I feel a little bit less capable of speaking to the infrastructure part of it just based on where my expertise is. But in terms of thinking of the local, state, federal levels, I think after listening to Philip and Chrissy's descriptions of what can change with infrastructure, I think it's going to be pivotal on the local level to include the local populations in the conversation. And when you talk about those $50 words that you referenced earlier, I think that people often get barred out of the conversation very early on because we're having conversations with really technical jargon laden topics, and it's easy to get lost. And then Chrissy also mentioned, people don't necessarily recognize the difference between an electric stove and a gas stove and what that means for their personal health. And when you zoom out to like the state and federal level, there are tools that exist based on the federal plain language guidelines of 2010 that we can help apply to our communications to make sure that they're accessible in terms of the way that we talk about risk and what that means for a personal environment, or the way that we present numbers to make sure that people that don't have a lot of training in graphs can understand. So I think putting the money up early in terms of outreach and making sure that people are brought into the conversation instead of making it necessary for them to like seek it out is really important to make sure that it's an equitable process and that people who are going to be affected are part of the conversation from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that there's very little votes on data. You can't show somebody a nice chart and be like, can I get your vote? It is true, but keeping people informed does build that trust with people, and that can lead to people getting elected. I mean, trust me, there's nothing more valuable in the government work that everybody's trying to do than the trust of the citizens. And I think that you make a big deal about a big point about that. So we know we're in Massachusetts, so there's a big consensus about the need for action in climate. Just the recent passed and signed climate change bill attests to that. On the federal level, we'll also hope for an infrastructure bill that's going down its path, and the president's out there beating the drum about that. And that should help build back better. But in this journey for a more sustainable and resilient infrastructure, what do you think the next quantum leap in action come from? Government investment, utilities, regulations? Who's got the biggest? I'm a big fan of having From Good to Great, this book about how companies get from good to great, and they talk about BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. Who's got the big, hairy, audacious goal? Government investment, you think is going to make the difference? Utilities, lenders, property owners. I mean, Phil's path about having these templates for every single building owner, it puts the power directly in this building owner. So, who do you think is going to have that type of have the next quantum leap in this conversation, Katie?
Yeah, it's hard for me not to think about this being partially driven by government investment and regulators, just in terms of the scale of change that needs to happen. I will again defer to Philip and Chrissy for the more nitty gritty in terms of this, but I think that it's going to have to be large scale, particularly in Boston. And I know that there's modeling happening right now in a bunch of the schools in the local area in terms of which areas are going to be most vulnerable in different timeframes. And I think that's going to be pivotal to inform how that large scale changes in the near future.
Phil, who do you think?
Yeah, sort of more on the nitty gritty side. I think the strategies, the technologies, the approaches that we need to address these societal problems, I think those already exist. I don't think we need quantum leaps in the sense of new. I mean, certainly ongoing research and development and breakthroughs on technology and implementation. Those are all great. However, we have the strategies available to us. I think the quantum leaps come from the thorough policy work, development and planning, good education that involves a variety of stakeholders, robust analysis that's truthful and honest about the real costs of these changes we want to make, and really strong collaboration among stakeholders. And I think that's where the big breakthroughs come in, not in you know, we're not talking nuclear fusion and you know, rocket science here. It's really about using the tools that we already have in front of us and employing them to the benefit and to tackle these large problems.
So not a moonshot, but a leap of faith. Let's get to it.
Yeah.
Chrissy?
I'm going to say that a lot of this like transitional power actually relies in the hands of like trade labor workers and unions specifically. So we've seen a lot of pushback from the trade industry in moving in the direction of energy efficiency and environmentalism, mostly because large trades and large unions don't have the education to be able to complete the tasks that they're gonna be required of them. Or that it's just like a job that doesn't exist. So we can't transition to solar power if we don't have people who can install solar panels, right? So educating an entire workforce to do these retrofits, to do these home energy assessments, to install this infrastructure is far more important than making laws about them. Because we can make laws every day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can implement them. And if we start to educate people on how to implement them, then they'll become advocates for themselves and their communities to help push those laws forward and be able to carry them through. And so I think that that's something that's really important that we need to keep our eyes and ears open for and push for.
Yeah, and we better get to that because people don't really understand. I mean, they're saying that, you know, you saw the coal workers are like, hey, you're shutting down these operations. Where am I getting my next job from? So if we're not communicating right to those people, hey, these are the jobs and how you can get to them. Those not only pathways on how to make things less, you know, pollutant and more environmentally friendly, but how do we get people into those jobs that are going to get us to that next level? That's a really good point. Listen, I'm looking at the clock. I think 7 minutes is what we got. I got a bunch of other questions digging into Katie's work and Phil and Chrissy's work. I think it would be a big mistake not to talk about racial justice. You know, we are in a reckoning time, in a moment in our history that I think that we should. Can you talk a little bit about your work, each of you are doing, and tell us about how that there's what type of impact your work would have through a racial lens? And I'll start again with Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. This is a critical question, and it's a reckoning that we as individuals and as organizations need to confront dead on. You know, as a part of this policy development process, the city of Boston made it really clear that racial justice and equity was a key and central component of the work. And so we as a team worked with two local partner organizations, one Square World and Alternatives for Community and Environment, to convene a resident advisory group to hear from the stakeholders who would most be affected by this policy, the residents of these multifamily buildings, for example, and did a series of listening sessions to get the feedback and the input from the most vulnerable populations in Boston. And you know, we heard a series of 6 things that came through as key priorities, and the city has folded those into the policy design process. And I think I applaud the city for doing that, and I think it's an absolutely central and critical aspect of the process. And just real quickly, I'll run through that list. What we heard from the residents is that the policy needs to be designed for equity to improve air quality in buildings for residents. It needs to reduce tenant energy bills. It needs to not contribute to displacement, gentrification. It needs to improve the thermal comfort in homes. It needs to create jobs for residents, and it needs to improve environmental quality. And those are the goals that we need to hold in front of us. What we have heard from the people who will be most impacted by this work.
Yeah, I feel silly saying it, but Katie, can you tell me a little bit about how you feel like this, your work looks at it through a racial lens?
Sure. So there's very well established connections between health literacy and health disparities that exist, and that goes across racial lines, it goes across income lines, it goes across formal education lines. And when you extend that to the environmental context, there's very strong demonstrations of disparities in terms of environmental health exposures and the health outcomes that are associated with that. And I think that by improving our communications to people is one route whereby we can start to reduce some of these inequities in terms of access to information, and improving possibly environmental health disparities by providing that information. And I think by communicating it in a way that's accessible to all parties, you can reduce some of those health disparities.
Yeah, I mean, I knew it went without saying, but I think it's important to hear from your words. And Chrissy, we know you just need to look at your maps. We knew where you went. And so, but can you talk to a little bit about it?
Yeah, the maps were a dead giveaway, like you say, and like you mentioned. But in a class that I took with Dr. Jenny Stevens at Northeastern called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership. Part of that class endeavor I had embarked on, I learned about seeding, which is this concept where if one family in a neighborhood gets solar panels, there are neighboring families are more likely to get solar panels also. And that theory is, it works like 4 times more in BIPOC neighborhoods than it does in white neighborhoods, I guess you would say. And I wondered why. And the why is that those neighborhoods are more trusting of their neighbors because they have like more community. And so if you can convince one person in the community to like do something for their health, well-being, resilience, it can literally start a revolution and encourage the entire neighborhood to get solar panels. In New York City, it convinced an entire block to get new toilets. The city did this thing where they gave people toilets that flushed less water for free, just like, please take these more efficient toilets. And it worked very well through seeding in BIPOC neighborhoods. And if we can, I don't want to say like take advantage because that's not the right word, but if we can incorporate the community and the ability for, seeding to take place in terms of educating like one member and then letting the community internally develop and implement these things in terms of like racial equality, giving them the like autonomy and the motivation and like the resources that they need to accomplish those goals themselves, I think that it would be more fruitful than us just like shoving incentives at them, letting them, rise from within.
Well, Christy, that's 100% true, because my mom used to say, go, vete a la vecina's house. Vecina is neighbor, and and we get hood from people talking about their neighborhood, so 100%. That's a really good point. And the piece about seeding, Phil, you can imagine if we can get one person in that neighborhood to go through one of the templates, a 3-deca template, and then he or she'll be bragging about how much they've saved or on energy or how warmer they are inside their house. That will spread like wildfire. By the way, if you don't do it the right way, if you don't have the trust in the data that you're giving to people, you're not using the right languages, you're never going to get that first seed planted. It's just never going to happen. And so that's a nice way to end, because it shows you that in this effort that we're trying to, again, in the places that don't have racial, diversity, they're already ahead of the game on all this stuff. They're already buying these things and doing these things way ahead than communities that don't have that thing. So knowing that the places we need it most to happen, that if we can get good data and communication to people in a way that they can be trustful of it, you know, we can attack those areas and then and build the type of infrastructure we need. Dave, that's all I got for you, brother. I hope we did a good job. Katie, Chrissy, and Phil, I feel like we try to figure out a conversation on how we build back better. Everybody says it. And Katie, don't worry about it. I don't know any of this stuff. I would just throw it in my opinion too. So just because you're not doing the nitty gritty stuff, we're going to be looking towards smart people like you, and we appreciate Bari bringing us together to get to the bottom of it.
Dan, thank you so much for steering this conversation with this amazing panel of leaders. I want to thank Philip, Katie, and Chrissy, and I just want to thank everyone for attending today's panel. Please stay tuned for next week's lineup of panelists and moderators. And if you have any other questions and want to follow up with Dan or any of the panelists, please let me know and I'll connect you. But thank you all for your time, your effort, and continue to do the work that you're doing now so that we can rebuild and really just give the people the best living experience that they need. So thank you guys so much. Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy the weekend. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.